Welcome to episode 51 of FBI Retired Case File Review with Jerry Williams. I'm a retired agent writing crime fiction inspired by actual FBI cases. In this episode, we speak with retired agent Jim McGee. Jim served nearly 21 years with the FBI. He is interviewed about being a member of the FBI Hostage Rescue Team, HRT, one of the world's most elite counter-terrorism teams. McGee provides a first-hand account of his participation in the HRT's first dynamic assault mission, which resulted in the successful hostage rescue of 9. In 1991, a violent group of Cuban inmates in the Federal Correctional Institution in Talladega, Alabama, overpowered their guards and took hostages. The inmates were demanding that they not be deported back to Cuba. The HRT was called in, and the hostages were rescued, unharmed. For their efforts, McGee and the other HRT members were awarded the FBI Medal of Meritorious Achievement. McGee wrote a book about his experience, Phase Line Green. It's available by contacting McGee directly. I was absolutely mesmerized by McGee's account of what happened during this dynamic HRT assault. We spoke for over an hour and a half. I did some editing because I did not want to have to make this a 2-part episode, but it's still on the long side, so I'm not going to do a long intro. I do want to thank you so much for your support of my 50th episode. It was great to hear from those of you who really enjoyed the 10 cliches and misconceptions about the FBI in books, TV shows, and movies. And for those of you who thought I did a great job reading my first chapter of Pay to Play, I want you to know that no Hollywood or TV producers have called me yet, but there's still hope. And I especially thank all of you that went out and downloaded a copy of Pay to Play or purchased the trade back. That was also amazing, and I appreciate that so much. As you know, I make no income from hosting and producing FBI Retired Case File Review, so my expenses and my time are all supported by those of you who have purchased Pay to Play. I'm not expecting to get rich from book sales, but it does help to defray the cost. Plus, it's a good read. Now here's the show. Hi, everyone. I want to welcome my guest, Jim McGee. Hi, Jim.
Hi, Jerry. How are you doing?
I'm doing great. I spent all day yesterday reading your book, Phase Line Green. The book was fascinating, and the book gives why don't you tell us, what's the book about, and what were you trying to get across when you wrote it?
It's all about the 1991 rescue of 9 hostages at the Federal Correctional Institute in Talladega, Alabama. The rescue was conducted by the FBI's Hostage Rescue Team, which I was a member of at the time.
I can't wait to hear from you directly. But before we do that, if you could tell us when you joined the FBI and why you joined the FBI.
Well, I entered on duty in November of 1986, and actually, the reason I joined the FBI, unlike a lot of people who had always dreamed of being an agent, since they were children, I needed a job. That's what it boiled down to. But at the same time, I was working for the Ventura County Sheriff's Office in Ventura, California. That's in Southern California. And I had gone to work for the Sheriff's Office right after college, and I wanted to work at the federal level. So the FBI advertised in the LA Times that they were going to hire some agents, and I applied. And I beat the odds and got hired.
Now, had you had any military training before you worked for the Sheriff Department?
I had not. My undergraduate degree is in forestry, believe it or not, and I had worked in that capacity as a wildlands firefighter for 5 years through college, and then I was initially hired as a forester upon graduation, But politics and economics at the time, some of the new hires were laid off, and I happened to be one of them. And that's when I decided to go with the sheriff's office, who were hiring, at that time immediately, and I needed to transition to another job. So I went with the ASO. I liked law enforcement, and I'd done a little bit of it in the Forest Service as well. So when the FBI advertised, it just seemed like it was going to be a good fit.
Well, the reason I asked you about military service is, from reading your book, it seems like you were interested in applying for the HRT, the Rescue Rescue Team, almost as soon as you joined the FBI. And I would imagine that a lot of people who are members of the HRT were former military, especially Navy SEALs.
Well, surprisingly, the HRT is a mixture of backgrounds. There are some former military, and there are some former Navy SEALs and Army Special Forces and Marines and all the above from the various branches. But at the same time, you have a lot of former law enforcement, and then you have guys that were, school teachers or accountants or attorneys, kind of like the general population within the FBI itself. So I think that's one of the great strengths, not only of the FBI, but also the HRT, was the diversity and the variety of backgrounds. That's something that is unlike any other counter-terrorist team in the world. That's something that the FBI has and really adds to their capabilities and their strengths. Having been a wildlands firefighter, I was on an initial attack firefighting helicopter crew within the Forest Service. So it's about as paramilitary as it can get. And then, of course, going into the sheriff's office, you're still in that somewhat paramilitary environment. And then the FBI it attracted me. And as I came upon my 4th anniversary in the Albuquerque field office, which was my first office of assignment, I had received orders to New York. And I said, well, I'd like to control my own destiny. And I saw that there was going to be a selection for the HRT, and that was the driving force. I said, I'd like to be a member of a team like that, and at the same time control my own destiny. So I applied and was invited back to the selection.
And we do want to, I do want to give you a chance to tell us more about the HRT, but before you do that, just one last question. Were you a member of the SWAT team in Albuquerque?
I was a member of the Albuquerque SWAT team in the FBI. In fact, I joined the SWAT team literally within just months of arriving there as a first office agent, because I had prior law enforcement experience, and I had a lot of experience, working with these various, rotor wing type assets in the Forest Service. Joining the SWAT team was a good fit as well. And so that really started me off. And the team leader was a former HRT guy. So, I was able to pick his brain in terms of what being on the HRT would be like.
I would imagine that a prerequisite of joining HRT had to be SWAT. You had to have at least been a member of your field office SWAT team. Yes?
No, it's not. It's not a required prerequisite. I mean, it's recommended just so that you have an idea of what it's like to work in that environment within the FBI. But the HRT, it's a whole different environment as compared to the SWAT teams. I mean, within the Bureau, you have the small field office SWAT teams like the one in Albuquerque, and then you have the enhanced teams in, the major metropolitan areas like New York and Los Angeles and such. But none of them are in the full-time capacity, 24/7, 365 days a year like you have on the HRT. And they also don't have the same capabilities, obviously as the HRT in terms of explosive breaching and the ability to, the various delivery systems, fast roping and et cetera. So being on the HRT is a lot different. I mean, that is, it's a tier 1 counter-terrorist team, and there's only 3 like that in the United States, one in the Army, one in the Navy, and one in the FBI.
Yeah, why don't we take some time now to talk about the hostage rescue team. Could you tell us a little bit of the history, why the FBI felt it necessary to create such a team?
It's best to start in 1972. If you can remember back, some listeners probably weren't even born then, but nevertheless, the Summer Olympic Games in Munich, Germany. This was a big event in terms of the Olympics because the previous time that Germany had hosted the Olympics was during World War II, under the reign of Hitler. So Germany obviously had a desire to put on a different type of Olympics, much more appealing, much more friendly than what they had, back in the 1940s. So 72 rolls around, and then, of course, we had the terrorist attack by the Black September that took the Israeli Olympic team hostage and ultimately ended up killing all of the members. That was a real blemish on the Olympics. It was a blemish on Germany because they didn't have the resources to respond appropriately. Now we fast forward to 1984, and here comes the Olympics that are going to be hosted in the United States, first time in quite a while. And they started to think about a scenario similar to what happened in Munich. And did the United States have the resources to respond appropriately? And they didn't, because the military capabilities, posse comitatus, is going to prevent them from operating within the United States. So the director at the time, William Webster, went to an exercise and watched the Army Special Forces, the guys out of Bragg, okay? And he watched them do an exercise and basically neutralize some terrorists. And then he asked the commander of this team, why don't your operators have any handcuffs? And, this guy said, well, we're war fighters. We don't handcuff. So Director Webster, noticed right there and decided, look, we need a capability that is based in law enforcement, federal law enforcement. And the best place for that to be is with the FBI. So that was the genesis of the HRT. The very beginning was in response to preparations for the 1984 Summer Olympics in Los Angeles. And then, of course, the team was developed and became operational in 1983. And here we are 33 years later. I don't know how many generations have come and gone. I was a member of the seventh generation, having joined the team in 1990, so 7 years after its inception.
And so what's the main purpose of the hostage rescue team? Although in the name, it tells you a lot right there.
Well, hostage rescue, I would categorize that as the bread and butter of the HRT. But the missions are varied from dignitary protection, providing security at these large major events like the Olympics, which was, the inception in 1984, pursuing violent fugitives, various types of maritime operations, renditions, where they'll go overseas and snatch a terrorist to bring back to be tried here in the United States. Even hurricane relief, responded multiple times to try to bring security to areas that have been devastated by hurricanes. We did that several times in the Caribbean. And so the list goes on and on. The HRT has it responds to many, many different types of missions, and most are never publicized. So you never even know that the hostage rescue team was there in some capacity.
Whenever I was at the FBI Academy and the HRT members were there, all I could say is it looked like out of central casting. You guys were the tallest, most fit group of people. And when you walked into, say, the cafeteria, everybody knew, these are HRT members because you guys all look like you had been casted for that role. That doesn't take away from, the very serious, assignments that you had. But I was always impressed just by, the appearance of the team.
Yeah, they're kind of the poster type. It's an interesting group of guys, I got to tell you. Mostly, I would say, alpha males, very, very mission-focused. They'll be with you till the bitter end. I can't say enough about them. For me, it was the best years of my life in the FBI. Just great experience. And, the fitness part, that is a critical piece. And that comes out day one in the selection process. Cardiovascular fitness and the ability to handle more than just your body weight, but I would say like twice your body weight is absolutely critical to mission success. You have to be able to be fit, and the last thing you want is to have some sort of failure in terms of aerobic or anaerobic capability during a mission. I mean, you have to, that can't be something that just jeopardize what you're trying to do.
Just so that people can get a better understanding of the physical demands, can you compare HRT training to what we know or what we've seen in movies about Naval SEAL training and Army Special Forces training? How does that compare?
It's very similar because, at the inception of the hostage rescue team, they reached out to, both their Army and Navy counterparts, and actually some foreign counterparts, like the British SAS, and used a lot of their ideas and their physical requirements and their various events to test, physical capabilities. It's a very similar process, both in the selection, and then it continues after selection during new operators training, and then it continues, throughout your time while assigned to the hostage rescue team. Every day there's hours set aside specifically for fitness, and that's a critical piece. Weapons proficiency, firearms and fitness are two critical skill sets that you absolutely have to be able to function there. That's why you don't see any old HRT operators, because when you hit 40, you're hitting the periphery of just not being able to do it anymore physically.
So it's almost like a professional athlete.
It's very similar to a professional athlete. That had always been my dream, early on, was to, play professional football. But injuries, didn't allow that to happen. So it just seemed like the HRT provided me that outlet. And then you take it up a notch because playing on Saturday or Sunday on the gridiron, yeah, you're right. I mean, there's risk involved, but you're probably not going to get shot and killed. You're not going to be facing, incoming. And that's the big difference. The term warrior is used, I think, too freely nowadays. I got a lot of respect for the guys playing on Saturday and Sunday, but they're not warriors. The warriors are the guys in the trenches within the special operations, with the military, within law enforcement, guys and gals, that are risking their lives. Those are your warriors right there. So
I know from your book that you played Division I football, but definitely being on the HRT was beyond those physical demands.
Absolutely. I mean, there's a lot of, there's a good percentage of operators that played, college sports. And that's a good prerequisite because it instills, some of the discipline that you need to survive in the environment. But at the same time, it's being on a counter-terrorism team takes it to the next level. And it's great, though, having that discipline because it's kind of ingrained in you, the need to train and work out every day and to stay fit. So it's an important part. It becomes a part of your lifestyle. It's not something you do extra. It's something you do every day as part of your lifestyle. I mean, that's just another thing you do.
All right, and you used the word operator, and so that's what team members called each other?
Right. In the vernacular of the HRT or counterterrorism, generally the guys that are going to be going past baseline yellow and are going to actually stage at baseline green, those are operators. Those are your gunslingers. Those are the team members that are, actually conducting the operations. They're going into the crisis site to handle whatever the mission requires.
All right. So then why don't we go ahead and begin talking about that? And I know there were many missions that you were involved in during your, was it 6 years?
Correct, 6 years.
On the HRT. But today we're going to concentrate on the Talladega prison riot in 1990?
In 1991, September of 1991.
Now, could you give us a little history on this? Because we all have heard that there were a number of prison riots earlier, maybe 3 years earlier in 1987 in Atlanta and in Oakdale. What was the difference between those prison riots and the one that you're going to talk to us about?
Well, I guess there were a lot of similarities, and similarities included the fact that those responsible for the riot were all inmates that had come into the United States as part of the Mariel boat lift from Cuba back in the 1970s. A lot of things happened with those immigrants or refugees, however you want to categorize them. Some were able to assimilate right into America. In fact, most were able to assimilate into American society and become, productive American citizens. Others, because Castro had emptied his prisons and his mental asylums, they came into the U.S. and, kind of continued with their way of life as criminals, many of them. So what happened was they were arrested for other crimes in the U.S. after they got within our borders, went through the court system, were convicted, and then sentenced to various facilities at the federal level, to include Atlanta, Oakdale, and then eventually Talladega. Now, when the riots erupted at Atlanta and Oakdale, it was almost simultaneous. It was because of conditions within the facilities, but for the Cubans, they wanted to have more reviews with what was then the Immigration and Naturalization Service, so the INS. Of course, that's all changed now with Department of Homeland Security, but back during that time frame, we had the Immigration and Naturalization Service. So they were asking for new proceedings to review each of their individual cases to see if they could basically negotiate, and a lot of them, wanted to have their prison terms reduced, or if they'd already served the time that they were given for their crimes, they wanted to be, released. So these were all the issues. None of them wanted to go back to Cuba during this time frame because Castro had kicked them out, and so to go back to Cuba was kind of like signing your own death warrant. And they knew that he was not going to have a welcoming reception there for them when they arrived. Chances are that they'd be met on the tarmac and be executed. So they wanted to just have new proceedings here in the U.S. Both of the Oakdale, Louisiana, and Atlanta prison riots were basically, they came to fruition through negotiations. They never had to do a tactical assault. So now fast forward to 91, 2 or 3 years later. And what's happened now is the inmates that were responsible for Oakdale and Atlanta, many of them, about 121, were transferred to the FCI Talladega. And that's where they were all housed together in the Alpha unit. The Talladega incident was basically conducted by the same inmates that had been responsible for Atlanta and had been responsible for Oakdale. But those inmates had been transferred to Talladega so they could all be isolated at one facility within the federal prison system.
How many actual inmates were involved in the initial riot?
All of the Cuban inmates in the Alpha unit were involved.
And how many is that?
121 was the number that were housed in that facility. There were other inmates in that facility because that was also where they had disciplinary segregation for the entire Federal Correctional Institute at Talladega. Basically, there were 3 units. It just so happened that the Cubans were held in the Alpha unit versus one of the other 2 units. But when any inmate was disciplined and then classified to disciplinary segregation, they would be sent to the Alpha unit. That was the whole, okay? So they would be placed in a cell there in solitary confinement. So at the time of the riot, there were some inmates that were not Cuban, but they were in the Alpha unit. Now, the Cubans tried to include those inmates as hostages as well, but the authorities never bought into that those other inmates were going to be considered hostages in addition to the civilian personnel that were in there at the time of the takeover.
All right, so why don't we talk about them? Who were the hostages?
Well, the hostages, they were employees of INS and the Bureau of Prisons, basically those two agencies that worked within the unit. Obviously, the individuals from the Bureau of Prisons were there, in the capacity of the guards, and then the other INS personnel were there to, review files and make decisions with respect to classification and those types of responsibilities. So, and they were both, both genders, male and female. There weren't any female guards per se, but several women were working there for INS. These were the people that were taken hostage.
So from reading the book, I understand that the FBI HRT had a role, and then the Bureau of Prisons had their own kind of SWAT team.
Right, their SORT team. Right.
Could you tell us what your different roles were and how you worked together in this incident?
Well, the Bureau of Prisons, they have their SORT teams, which would respond during prison riots and other types of uprisings to come in and, quell the situation. The difference is that here we had, some violent Cuban inmates that had basically articulated a demand that unless their demands were met, I guess the best way to understand this is the Cuban inmates were stuck in a limbo type position. In other words, they had come to the U.S. as part of the Merrill boat lift. They had committed crimes in the U.S., gone through the court system, been convicted, sentenced, and now they were in the federal, facilities, in particular Talladega, and many of them had completed, their prescribed sentence, but they still were not being released. All right, so they were doing like life terms because there was an INS hold on them. They were not going to be released back into American society because they'd already shown that many of them, they were all violent felons, murderers, rapists, thieves, robbers, burglars. So they're not going to release them back into the American society. So there were negotiations going on with Cuba, and basically saying, Cuba, you need to take these guys back. And what had happened is right there during that time frame of that uprising at Talladega, Cuban authorities had agreed to take back these inmates. Well, these inmates knew, like I mentioned earlier, that going back to Cuba was not going to be a good thing for them. They're doing a life term basically in the United States, but if they go back to Cuba, they're going to be facing a death sentence probably as soon as they get off the plane. So that was one of their demands. We do not want to go back to Cuba. We want to have, each of our cases reviewed, and then we want to be, released because we've completed our sentence. So you can see the dilemma that they're faced with. And so as a result, they took over the prison, they took hostages, and they made the demand, you either give us new hearings or we're going to kill these hostages. Well, as soon as that happened, the Bureau of Prisons, because it falls within the FBI's jurisdiction, it's a federal facility, they're threatening the lives of these federal officers in the form of the Bureau of Prisons and also these other INS personnel and employees. That falls within the purview of the FBI and, of course, as the name implies, the FBI Hostage Rescue Team. The final option. That's what the HRT does. It responds to those types of high-risk situations. So that's what brought the HRT into the equation. Technically speaking, even though we really weren't talking about it back then in 1991, this was an act of terrorism. You had a group of individuals that were basically making demands upon the United States government in furtherance of a political ideology, in that they didn't want to be sent back to Cuba. They wanted to have new hearings. They wanted to have the whole process revamped, or they would kill hostages. All
right, so at this point, you've been on the HRT for a year?
Just about a year. So I'd been through selection, new operators training, and then some other enhanced training with our military counterparts, and I was assigned to one of the assault teams.
Would this be your first major incident that you would be deployed?
Yes, it was. I'm just trying to reflect back on that. The Talladega there were a lot of firsts about Talladega. It was my first deployment, having come on the HRT and then being assigned to one of the assault teams. Ultimately, this became the first dynamic assault that the HRT conducted in the form of a hostage rescue. In their existence at this time, from 1983 to 1991, they had never done a dynamic hostage rescue team type assault.
Well, let's start from the very beginning. So this is your first deployment. The HRT where's their home? Where's their home base?
So they're based out of, this is common knowledge, but they're based out of Quantico at the FBI Academy. That's where they have their main compound. So,
all right, so you're there at the Academy. When do you first learn that your team is going to be deployed to Talladega?
Within hours of the takeover by the Cubans, we're notified of the situation. At the time, we're off duty, and I believe we were. We would get a page. This was, before cell phones. So you'd get a page with a certain numeric signal telling you, okay, this is a real world emergency. We need to muster at the FBI compound. Basically there you'd get a warning order in terms of what's going on. And then the next thing is, you're getting your gear ready that you envision you're going to need. So we know we're going into a kind of somewhat of a closed environment and within a federal prison. And you get your kit bags basically squared away, load them up on the man-out trucks, and all of the requisite other assault vehicles. In those days, before the Humvees, we used Suburbans, and all that plus the operators moved toward Andrews Air Force Base. And that's where we deploy out of on a military aircraft and then fly into the closest location that can accommodate either a C-141 or a C-130 near the crisis. And then from there move to the crisis site. So that's exactly what happened. That's what we did in preparation for the Talladega situation.
So you have just moments' notice before you have to report and gather your gear and head out.
That's correct. By the time you get the notification, they would like to see wheels up out of Andrews within 2 hours.
Okay.
So, they want a quick response to get to wherever we're going to go.
Now, I take it that HRT had been deployed for Atlanta and Oakdale also, but the difference is that they did not have to go in.
That's accurate. I mean, this was before I was on the HRT, but I just know historically from doing the research for the book and all, that when Oakdale occurred, the HRT deployed to that in Louisiana, and then Atlanta occurred, and there was an issue with having enough personnel to split between the two locations. So that's when they reached out to our Army counterpart to come in and try to backfill for us for the HRT at Atlanta. But then, the HRT was able to do some things to get some of their operators up to Atlanta as well, so that we didn't have this military team there in that role of basically domestic law enforcement. And at the same time, you can augment some of the responsibilities and defer them to enhanced SWAT. And some of the enhanced SWAT teams from either Washington field office or the Miami field office, they can come up and provide capabilities. Atlanta didn't have an enhanced team yet. That didn't come around until later for the 96 Olympic Games when they started to build out all those capabilities in Atlanta. But, you could rely upon field SWAT to also provide some of the capabilities like perimeter security, things like that.
Can you tell us a little bit, you're now, at the prison, what's the setup? What's the organization? I take it that you need to have split the teams up in a way that there's always going to be 24/7 coverage. Can you share with us what you can about how that's organized?
Well, once we arrive on scene, there's the first thing they're going to do is give us an update in the form of another warning order, and eventually they're going to literally sit down and the team's going to be apprised of the op order, for the mission, the operations order. Some of the things that are going on is they're going to be developing a deliberate assault plan and then also an emergency assault plan, just in case And this happened. Inmates start to act up, or there seems to be an emergency situation involving the hostages. You need to have that emergency assault plan ready to go, and you need to have assets in the form of an assault team or two standing by and fully jocked up in their gear and ready to go in the event of an immediate need, an emergency. So all that's in the works. Then at the same time, the commander of the HRT and then the assault team supervisor and then the various team leaders are going to be doing a team leader recon where they're going to be, reviewing the perimeter, reviewing the situation. Of course, you got the tech agents that are there, and they're always helping with providing, technological support in terms of getting our communications in place. And you're going to want voice privacy. You don't want the media tapping in. During that situation, after the takeover by the Cuban inmates, they got their hands on some of the prison personnel's radios, and they started using those to reach out and talk to the media. So the FBI techs, which are do an amazing job, they were able to jam those frequencies so the inmates could no longer communicate, with the outside and with the media. But all of this is taking place, and then of course you're putting out the sniper observers. Not a big need for them in this situation because we have all the inmates confined within the Alpha unit, and they really can't. At least we didn't think they could get out, get outside of the unit. But we did have sniper observers in place, and that's good because ultimately some of the inmates were able to break out through the interior ceiling and get up on the roof of the facility and display bed sheets with their demands and we're prepared to die and we want our freedom and things like that. So having the sniper observers there to call out immediately when those inmates were able to get up on the roof was that was critical. So all this is happening, and then at the same time the HRT is starting to do several things. We have to continuously, maintain those skills that will diminish over time. Principally, what I'm saying is firearms, weapons proficiency. So we can't, go for days or weeks without shooting because, that proficiency will decrease if you don't shoot frequently. And in this type of situation, you're going to be there's a good chance you're going to be required to do some surgical type shooting, And then you're also thinking about the rehearsals, basically having a facility that's similar to the Alpha unit that we can use to rehearse all of our tactics, all of the potential breaching capabilities that are going to be deployed, everything associated with if we get called to do a dynamic assault or an emergency assault, we need to have familiarity with the crisis site. So it's not something brand new when we run in there. We've at least been into a location that's similar, from a rehearsal perspective. So as you can see, there's a lot of stuff going on.
Right. So what do you do? Is there another unit at the prison where you move out the inmates so you can rehearse in a similar space?
That's exactly right. So the unit just adjacent to the Alpha unit, it was like a mirror image of the Alpha unit with very little difference between the two. Some of the inmates were moved. Some of them were just left in their cells and their windows were blackened out so they couldn't watch our movements and our tactics. And we used that facility to rehearse all of our movements. I mean, down to the most finite issues. I mean, I knew that when I entered the Alpha unit, in the event we were going to do a dynamic assault, exactly how many steps I had to take before I came to the first room that I was responsible for clearing. And then I knew exactly how many steps it would take to go from that door to the back wall of that room. And I mean, I that was all memorized so that if, and it's probably going to be the case, visibility is restricted or non-existent when you enter the facility during a dynamic assault. You can operate even in low light, low visibility just by counting your steps. so that you know you've reached the back wall of a certain room and you've cleared the room, and then you move out and, move on with conducting the hostage rescue.
How do you keep your calm, keep your head about you as you're entering, an assault situation, and you need to be able to do something so simple as to count your steps? I mean, I can't even envision being able to do that.
Well, I mean, there's several things that come into play. Number one, these are the characteristics that the HRT is looking for way back when they initially invite, an FBI agent, back to the selection process. These are the things that are being tested all through the selection, all through new operators training, is being able to work, under fire and not panic. I mean, that's a key. You absolutely cannot panic in these types of situations. And some of that comes naturally, and then the rest of it comes through training. You absolutely have to train, trust your training, and train at a level that is similar to the real world. That's, hard, realistic training was something, we always pledged. That's critical to mission success. And also confidence in your equipment. That's why, we would have at least once a week gear maintenance, because you have to have complete and total confidence in all of your equipment. You don't want any equipment failures, during the course of a dynamic assault and a hostage rescue. That's part of the essence of being on the HRT.
All right. So while the Bureau of Prisons and negotiators are trying to talk with the inmates and see if there can be some type of a release in negotiations, you guys are training and rehearsing for what I'm sure everybody hoped would not have to be a dynamic assault, but you're preparing for that. You're using that time, not just sitting around waiting, to see if you're going to be called in, but you're using that time to prepare.
Absolutely. No, we are training relentlessly every day. We're either, because we didn't have access to a firearms range, we're dry firing. We're dry firing our handguns. We're dry firing our shoulder weapons. We're going through all the mechanics, associated with the utilization of our weapons, making sure they're clean, making sure they're functional, all of that. Then at the same time, we're dedicating an hour or two a day to fitness. I mean, we had gone into an adjacent building there within the confines of the prison, where it was prison industries. So it was a huge manufacturing warehouse. I think they made like brooms or something like that. And we turned that into a fitness area where we'd run the perimeter interior, and stop and do different exercises, push-ups, pull-ups, sit-ups. And we would get a full workout. And then, of course, we also had access to the inmates' gym with weight equipment, cardiovascular equipment. So we're getting our workouts in. Everything's happening there. We're staying fit. And we're maintaining some semblance of weapons proficiency through dry firing. And so that basically means you're pulling the trigger on your handgun or your shoulder weapon, but it's not loaded. You won't have recoil, so you have to keep that in mind. But you're still, you're going through most of the mechanics that keep you proficient. So it can work temporarily. And Talladega was a 10-day operation, so we were able to keep our proficiency over that time period.
You talked about phase line green and phase line yellow. Why don't we talk about that a little bit now too?
Okay. Well, phase line yellow is what's considered the last point of cover and or concealment. So in other words, if you have an assault team of operators that's getting ready to move upon a crisis site, like Talladega, where you have Cuban inmates holding hostages, we were pre-positioned in what was normally the prison chapel. That's where we had set up our command post. So that is where we would get into the Suburbans and begin to move forward in the event of a dynamic assault. either deliberate or emergency assault. That is phase line yellow. That's the last point of cover and concealment. Once you leave that point and you're now moving to phase line green, you're generally exposed. Once you get to phase line green, now you're literally at the breach point. So you're going to set the charges in terms of a breach, an explosive charge, to breach through the door or the wall or the ceiling or wherever you've decided to make entry. I guess I've heard it referred to as the point of no return. Once you're at phase line green, you are just waiting for the command to execute from the commander, the HRT commander. So he's going to be on the radio. He's going to wait for each team leader to notify him that they are at phase line green. So he'll hear from each of the different teams. The hotel team is at green. Charlie team is at green. Echo team is at green. And then once he hears everybody is at green, then he's going to start the countdown. 5, 4, 3. That's when the snipers are going to engage targets of opportunity. 2, that's when the breaches are going to go. And then 1 is when you then move out and head toward the hostages and hopefully, have a successful hostage rescue.
All right. So we know there are, is it 9 hostages? 9, but, it started out with 11, but 2 were released through negotiations. One was a male that was injured during the initial takeover between the inmates and the prison officials. And he also had some heart issues too. So they actually released him, and then through negotiations. And then another was a female who was also having some health issues. They released her. Of course, anytime you get a hostage release, that's a ready source of intelligence. You really want to get with them and get as much information as you possibly can about things like where are the other hostages inside the facility, where were you held, were you getting enough food, were you being mistreated, which of the inmates is in charge, or is there a combination of inmates in charge, anything that they can tell you. What's their weaponry? Have they set up booby traps? That's all critical intelligence. Do you know about the inmates that you're going to be encountering? Have they been deprived of food?
Yes, initially they were. So all they had, within the prison facility, but you have what they call their canteen, their commissary. They purchase this on a weekly basis, and it's basically candy bars, cigarettes, stuff like that, potato chips. So they had that kind of stuff, but that's all they had to survive with. Of course, once they took the facility over, they could get access to, where the canteen was stored, things like that, but they didn't have any real nutritious food at their disposal. So initially they did not have much food, and as a result, the hostages were not given anything. They were starving, and this was one of our concerns. As negotiations went on, they started to provide them, some food if they would do something that the negotiators requested, like, for instance, release a hostage. As the food thing plays out, before we did the assault on the 10th day, they were actually given a big meal. The Bureau of Prisons, which had their SORT team, physically standing arm in arm, hand to hand, and surrounding the entire facility, they brought in barbecues and grilled steaks, out there. And the prevailing winds were blowing, that aroma into the Talladega facility. So those inmates are smelling, steaks on the grill. It had to be driving them absolutely crazy.
Was that the purpose? Or was it just to feed the staff?
It was a combination. It was to feed, the Bureau of Prison staff, the guys that were out there standing guard on the perimeter. But at the same time, it was also to entice the inmates to agree. And they did. So the negotiators agreed to give them a meal, and they did. I think it was hamburger and rice and maybe some other starches, and several containers of decaffeinated coffee. And this played right into the hands of the HRT, because as we're getting ready to do our assault at this point, these inmates are gorging themselves, which of course means within a few hours they're all going to be, sound asleep, with full bellies, which is what happened. Exactly what happened.
So what time did you go in?
The time that assaults are generally conducted is, in the early morning hours. In this case, 3:43, if I remember correctly, a.m. So in that time frame, between 3 and 4 a.m. And this is when people are the most vulnerable. You're into your REM sleep, and that's the best time to conduct an assault. And these guys, the inmates were all just snoring, having had a big meal, first one they'd had in a week and a half. Obviously, it was a big surprise when we showed up.
The decision to go in on that particular day, I understand the time that you chose and the purpose of that, but that particular day, why was that made? Well, negotiations had been going on for 10 days, and there was some success. I mean, they were able to achieve the release of 2 hostages. They were also able to negotiate, pill call, so where we could send medical staff up, and of course, part of that medical staff were actually HRT operators in white jackets, but they were there to, look and gather intelligence about the inmates. And then at the same time, the inmates would bring the hostages forward if they needed medical care in terms of medication, whatever, painkillers, whatever it might be. All these things were being negotiated and were happening, and they actually brought in some third-party intermediaries. In fact, what happened over those 10 days, and this is not atypical for hostage-type situations, is initially you'll have the negotiators talking directly to the hostage takers. Hopefully there's a person in charge. It seemed like there was a power struggle on the inside between 2 or 3 of the Cuban inmates. And at least one of those was a very violent, unstable person. So as the time transpired, a couple hostages get released. We're doing some pill calls. We're giving them some food here and there. Another thing to note, too, is anytime food goes into a facility, usually in some kind of cart or something, there's always devices. You'll never find them because our techs are so skilled at what they do, but there's going to be devices that are going to provide us with both audio and video of what's going on inside. Critical for intelligence as well. And so that was all of this is happening. It's all transpiring. But at the same time, things are starting to break down. So during one of those pill calls, one of the hostages, a female, seemed to be distraught. This was noticed by the medical personnel, and she was waving at the medical people, and it was as if she was saying goodbye. And then ultimately, we got a message from the inmates that said, we've had enough of this negotiation. Tomorrow, we're going to kill the first of the hostages, and we will put all of their identifications in a pillowcase, and we'll draw one of those identifications, and whoever it is, they will be murdered. Probably have their throat slit. This information comes back to the command post, through the negotiators and through the pill call medical team. And, the decision is made right there as it goes up the chain of command. And then ultimately to the acting attorney general, Bill Barr. He was the guy that was the AG at the time temporarily. And he had the guts to say, okay, this looks like this is not going to be negotiated to fruition. We're going to do a dynamic assault. So for the HRT, we're about to do what we train to do all the time. We're about to be able to put on display and use our skill sets to go in and rescue these hostages. So for us, this is like, let's do it. And that's exactly what happened. They told us, get ready to do it. And so then it was put into the HRT's hands, and the final preparations were put in place. It sounds like the fact that it was 10 days was almost an advantage to you as far as being able to prepare and to train. It was better that there had been several days of negotiation as opposed to you having to go in immediately after you land at the prison?
There's different schools of thought. You know, I'm a trained negotiator as well. And from a negotiation perspective, you like to draw things out. You like things to become protracted because you can then put the hostage takers through an emotional roller coaster, up and down, up and down. And, you know, that emotional roller coaster is extremely fatiguing mentally and emotionally. I mean, that does as much to break them down as, you know, not being able to sleep and not being able to eat and everything else. So there is some justification to having something become protracted in terms of tearing them down and ultimately negotiating a surrender. On the other hand, from a tactical perspective, there's always this concern that the longer it becomes protracted, the more hardened the target's going to become. The more they're going to barricade themselves. The more they're going to, you know, develop this resolve of not giving up. You know, it's a mixed bag there that can work both ways. Back during this time frame, it seemed like most of the operations that we went on lasted 10 days. In fact, we almost called it the 10-day rule. After 10 days, they either surrendered or we went in. But, of course, that changed with Waco, which was 51 days. But before that, 10 days was like the 10-day rule. Seemed to be a standard. With Talladega, you know, 10 days seemed to work okay. You know, they got a couple hostages released, and I think by the time we went in, the inmates were, well, they were obviously becoming desperate because they were getting ready to kill one of the prison guards. So it was the right time for that decision to be made.
All right, so before you go in, what do you know as far as where the hostages are being held, where the prisoners are? What kind of intelligence do you have about the setup that you're getting ready to?
Well, we're going to go in through 3 different breach points, all, you know, explosive breach points. And we know through overhears, intel from the hostages that were released, we know that there's 1 or 2 hotspots, which is the location where the hostages are being held. We know that they're either in one of those locations or they may have been split up and they're in both of those locations. So those are going to be where the assault teams head for first. They're going to be moving rapidly to those locations. You know, that's all pre-designated. We know where those locations are. We've rehearsed going to those locations in that mirror image facility next door. So, you know, we're ready to go. We're ready to move. Everything's in the preparations have been made to get to those locations as quickly as possible.
And where are you? What's your assignment?
Okay, I'm going to be the person that's going to be driving one of the assault vehicles for hotel team up to the front, just adjacent to the center gate, which will be the main door into the Alpha unit. So once the vehicle is placed, basically the front bumper right up against the wall, just adjacent to the front door to the facility, you know, I'll come out of the driver's seat and move around and take up the position of point man in the line of march. So I'm going to be the first person into the facility. That's going to be my role. You know, we get the go-ahead from the Attorney General. We get the final op order, and we get our gear ready, and we move up from phase line yellow now to phase line green, because as soon as I pull that vehicle up and park it, you know, nose first up against the exterior wall of the facility, we're technically at phase line green. Come out, move forward, and then basically hunker down just adjacent to the corridor that leads up to the front door of the facility. Now, we've got to do a few things here. We've got to get the charge on the front door. So our breacher and then a security guy are going to move forward and place the charge on the front door. Now, what we found out through intelligence was the first thing they had to do was get through a couple of metal gates that were locked with, a padlock and chain. So they had to break out some bolt cutters, cut the lock, open those gates, move forward, place the charge on the door. At the same time, I'm providing security, back at the entry into that corridor. Then they back out, get back into the line of march. We all give a thumbs up down from my position all the way back to the 8th person in the position. Once that thumbs up is received by the 8th person, it then comes back forward to the team leader, and he then contacts the HRT commander and tells him that we're at phase line green. So we're set to go. Now we're just waiting for the other teams to get to green as well.
Okay. So you're going to use the bolt cutters and some type of a charge to actually blow in some of these metal gates and entry doors?
Yeah, the entry doors into the facility where we were at are 2 heavy, solid metal steel prison doors, which you can envision. So a prison is designed so that people cannot break out, and so at the same time also designed so that people cannot break in. So this is a very difficult target. Now, we had gone to another prison in the state of Alabama and practiced detonating various sizes of explosive charges so that we were sure that when we attached this one to that door, it would be enough to blow the doors open.
So when you say you practiced, did you actually blow the doors open at that other facility?
Yes, we did.
Wow.
So basically, what was placed on those doors where I was at was 7 pounds of C4. Now, that's a big charge. That's a really big charge. It's the best way I can describe it is, once we were at phase line green, and then, the thing is, whenever you're conducting an operation, you're always going to have what's called Murphy's Law come into effect. There's going to be something that you just never anticipated happening is going to happen. And that happened to us right here at this point. The team to our left, they were trying to adhere their charge to their door where they would be making their entry. And what we didn't anticipate was this time of year in Alabama, it's very humid and there's a heavy dew in the morning. And so the doors were covered in moisture. So the charge, even with the sticky substance that would spray on the door to adhere the charge to the door, the charge would not stick to the door because it was too wet. So they basically determined they weren't going to be able to go through their breach point because their charge wouldn't stick to the door. So they can now call for what's referred to as an alternate breach, meaning they're going to have to follow us in through our breach, once we make entry. And then they're going to have to circle back and cover the areas that they were responsible for. Meanwhile, to our right, that team, they got their charge to stick to the door, but the non-electric shock tube, no-nail, which leads from the charge back to the shooter, who's in the line of march, who detonates the charge, that got tangled up. So they couldn't get enough of a standoff to detonate that charge safely. So now they're also kind of in a situation where they're not sure if they're going to be able to go into their breach point. But they decide to go ahead and detonate anyway. So they let them know they're at phase line green, and they're going to go ahead and do it anyway. So based upon all this, some other things are happening. I'm literally hunkered down right there at phase line green, number 1 in the line of march, waiting to get the execute. I look to this window right to my side, and there's 2 inmates looking at me.
Oh, God.
And so I'm like, well, that's not good, because basically we're compromised.
Right.
So once we're compromised, it's like, execute, go. So if I were to say to the team leader, we've been compromised, then he would reach out to the HRT commander, who's already given us compromised authority, which means execute. So I just gave a closed fist to those inmates and told them, hey, guys, stay right where you're at. Their eyes were so big because they couldn't believe what they were seeing, and they turned around and took off running. They were in that room that I was going to be responsible for. By the time they got out of that room, the HRT commander had already decided to go ahead and commence the assault. He gave us the countdown. The charges were detonated, and we were on our way. Those 2 inmates I found in there in the hallway. The overpressure from the charge had basically knocked them to the ground, and they were delirious, just laying there. not knowing what had happened.
So they had not reached the point where they could have warned anybody.
No, they had not. No.
Wow.
A few more seconds and they would have. This is what we're talking about. It just, seconds or milliseconds can make the difference between, success or failure. So we've made entry now. Now keep in mind, I had counted my steps. What's good because visibility was 0 because of the size of that charge, which it blew those 2 prison doors off their hinges, through the lobby, and then through the back wall of the lobby into the hallway.
So they worked.
So that it was plenty big enough. Anybody who would have been standing on the other side of those doors would have been, instantly, it would have been fatal for them. But the size of the charge, anybody that was anywhere near, in terms of an inmate, they were knocked down from the overpressure. In fact, I was knocked down because the overpressure is going both ways, and it came after the charge was detonated. The overpressure is coming back down that corridor, being channeled down that corridor toward our location, and then once it hit outside the corridor, it spread 180 in all directions. Me being in the line of march, I had a blast shield, in my arm to help protect me from the overpressure. It knocked that out of my hands, knocked me in the air 360, and it knocked my bailout bottle, and which is some compressed air if we need it inside, off my back. So I had to, regain my composure, jump up, and take off because everybody's following me in. And then, of course, once you get into the corridor, it's going to be full of debris. I had to climb about, over 4 foot of brick and mortar to get over and into the original lobby. And then of course, there's so much suspended, particular matter in the air. We really should have had we did once things calmed down a little bit, but we should have had our gas masks on to begin with because, that was, we're just sucking in all kinds of toxic materials. But bottom line is, once we were inside, it was, I think, 23 seconds, and 2 of the operators in the line of march, I think number 4 and 5, had pushed through to the first hot spot that we had identified, and there was a window into that room that they breached, and then they got a gun barrel in there to make sure it was all hostages. Then they told the hostages, to just put their hands in the air and move away. And then you could see the inmates trying to come around and come in through the other door into that room. The hostages had barricaded the door with mattresses that they had on the floor and had been sleeping on. So, much to their credit. But, we had guns on the hostages within 23 seconds. And then not long after that, they were being escorted out, to safety.
So the hostages were not in with the regular prison.
No, they were placed in a separate room, and
the prisoners had done that for what reason?
Yeah, they had been moving them around some, but at this point, we had current intelligence that put them right in this room, exactly where we suspected they would be, and they had just isolated them all in one room, just adjacent to the cell block, and that's where they had them contained there. The inmates had no idea what was coming. One of the ringleaders was located in that hallway by one of our operators, and when he came up on him, this operator is one of our breachers, and he also was a nose guard for West Point. And he's a big individual, and with all of his equipment, he probably weighs about 340 pounds when he's fully equipped for an assault. This one inmate, so basically he had been identified as one of the ringleaders. The operator that came up on him initially, like I say in the book, Freddy Krueger's worst nightmare. 340 pounds of operator standing there with a gun on you, and he looked down at him, and the inmate looked up and said in his Cuban accent, "What happened?" so that said it all. They had no idea what was coming, and it was a great operation for the HRT because there were no rounds fired by the HRT. Now the inmates were armed with zip guns, which is a type of weapon that is manufactured in the prison environment, or they, with paper mache, they create a barrel, and with match heads, they create an ignition source, and then they'll make a projectile, maybe out of pencil leads or something like that, and it can fire a round, and it's lethal, basically good for one round. So they had zip guns, they made slingshots because they had access to some surgical tubing, and then they took the nuts off as like file cabinets, so 1/4-inch nuts that they used, in a slingshot. Again, that could be lethal if it hits you in the head or something. So they had weapons like that, and then they had a lot of edged weapons, shanks, and homemade, manufactured swords, stuff like that. But nothing that's going to compete with, an MP5 with 30 rounds in a magazine, and then because we were loaded for bear. So, but no HRT operator fired any shots, and of course, once the hostages are secured, the rules of engagement change. Initially, when the hostages are at risk, then you're not going to sit and negotiate with an inmate that tries to impede your movement. They're going to die. Once the hostages are secure, then you may butt stroke that inmate or take them down with a control hold or something, because there's not the same emergency necessity to get to the hostages to save them.
Right, that mission has changed.
The mission has changed, exactly. So the rules of engagement changed. And that's another part of being on the hostage rescue team, having the presence of mind to know that the rules of engagement change, and you have to be able to, flow and move based upon what those are. Several inmates resisted, but they were met with a flashbang. I think one inmate got up under a bunk and wouldn't come out, but a couple flashbangs under that bunk changed his mind. so he came out. But, in essence, they were all taken back into custody, and then the next thing that happened, they were, brought out, handcuffed, and turned over to the Bureau of Prisons. FBI SWAT teams, followed us in later. After the hostages were secure and the scene was secure, then the whole cell block had to be searched. All the upper levels, every cell. Then we had to get into those cells where those other inmates that were in disciplinary segregation were held to see what their condition was. And that's where the SWAT teams came in and followed in trace of us and went through and cleared all of those areas, along with the Bureau of Prisons. The Bureau of Prisons provided the service of having keys to everything. So we had all of our mechanical breaching equipment too, saws and torches and everything. And they were used in a couple of cases to get into a cell, but generally having a key makes it a lot easier. And the Bureau of Prisons was able to provide that. So ultimately, everybody had a role to play, during the operation.
And at what point did the Bureau of Prisons SORT team take over in their normal role of handling the prison population?
Oh, immediately. We handed them as soon as the hostages were secured and the SWAT teams had gone in and cleared the entire facility. The SORT teams were right there to take custody of all of the inmates, all of the Cubans. It was interesting because they had all of them take off their shoes. I remember there were shoes everywhere. I guess that's a protocol. They don't expect they'll try to run away barefoot, I guess. I don't know what the deal is with that. But anyway, they had them all down, on their knees with their hands behind their heads, searching them, handcuffing them. And the thing is, the next day as we were boarding, our C-130 to head back to Quantico, there was a plane right next to us on the tarmac, and the United States Marshal Service and Bureau of Prisons, they were loading those inmates onto a plane one way to Cuba. Yep.
That fast?
That fast. The next.
Wow. And do we know what happened to them?
I don't think it was a happy ending, but nobody knows. I mean, who knows? Somebody knows, but I would not have wanted to be in their shoes. Apparently the arrangements had been made, and that's why they write it in the first place, because they knew they were within just days or hours of, being sent back to Cuba, and it happened.
All right, and the condition of the hostages?
Probably, they lost some weight, and, that's the thing about being on a hostage rescue team or counterterrorism team. Other than the fact we escorted the hostages out, you never have any contact with them again. Years later, the one prison official who was going to be the one executed, I was contacted by him, and I actually was in Northern Virginia. He lived up in Northern Virginia, I think Richmond. Doesn't work for the Bureau of Prisons anymore, never did after this situation. He asked me if I was going to be in the area to stop and have lunch with him, and I did. And then, I made arrangements. I'm talking years later, 15, 20 years later maybe, and I made arrangements for him to go and attend the HRT's morning meeting to allow him the chance to thank the HRT for saving his life. And, most of the guys on the HRT by then, had not been at Talladega. But still, for this guy to be able to go and do that, and for the HRT operators, even, the current ones, to hear an actual hostage rescued by the HRT to come in and give them the thanks, I thought that was really important, because that doesn't happen very often. You just, we move on to the next mission and they go off and live their lives. I mean, that's kind of the way it is.
Well, you were also thanked by the FBI. I understand that the team received the FBI Medal of Meritorious Achievement, for this rescue. That's correct. Yeah, each of us were, given the medal that goes along with that and put on a plaque that I believe is on display within the HRT building. That's correct. Yep. Wow.
Yeah.
In your time with the HRT after this incident, did you come anywhere near an assignment, a mission as important as this one was?
Well, in terms of a dynamic hostage rescue, nope. This was the one. It kind of I always looked upon this one because it was technically the first for the HRT, but it was kind of it set the standard similar to what the hostage rescue conducted by the SAS at the Iranian embassy did for them at Princess Gate. So in essence, I refer to Talladega to the HRT's Princess Gate. It put the HRT on the map as a counterterrorist team because they had done some work in a variety of jobs before 1991, but this one really showed the ability to conduct a dynamic assault and accomplish successfully all the pieces that fall into that, the rehearsals and the breach, and actually to even overcome, Murphy, who's always lurking in the background. We still were able to pull it off and do and have a successful hostage rescue. The thing about Talladega is it happened in 1991. The first Gulf War was going on, and so Talladega fell between the cracks. First of all, we were in a prison, so the media could not get anywhere near to monitor really what was happening in terms of our preparations and the day-to-day, going-ons between us and the inmates and negotiators. So the media couldn't report and they couldn't get it out, like they did in later years and like they do, nowadays currently. That constant stream of information or misinformation that's, coming into your living room or onto your social media. That didn't exist. So the HRT and the Talladega rescue, it was a historic event, but it kind of just slipped between the cracks, and not a lot of people know about it.
So I take it that's one of the reasons that you wrote your book.
That is. I wrote the book for two reasons. One, so my daughters would have some concept of what Dad was doing when he was gone for basically half of their lives growing up, and two, to memorialize the event for the HRT and the FBI because of its success.
All right. Now, you just said that, but when we were talking about your book, you let me know that it's out of print? I
mean, I have copies printed on demand as needed. Basically, I would tell the listeners if they want to get a copy, they can contact me directly.
I have one particular listener, Justin A., who is very interested in the HRT. So what can we tell him? This incident occurred in 1991. You left the HRT, I guess, in 1996?
Correct. Yep.
So what can we tell him about what you've told us today and how it is now? Has a lot changed as far as the training and the missions? The missions are going to remain the same. There's a greater emphasis, of course, on the threat from terrorism. There's a greater emphasis in international deployments, but at the same time, the HRT has deployed to quite a few domestic situations over the past 20 years. So the missions are not going to change that much. The equipment has gotten better, of course. That's to their advantage. Some of the weaponry has changed. Back in those days, we were carrying a 9mm, Browning high power as our pistol. That's upgraded now to a .45 caliber handgun, and of course the shoulder weapons have changed. But they have an arsenal to choose from. The HRT does. So as far as the warrior mentality, the physical requirements, and all the other characteristics, that I've discussed, those have not changed. Those are the same. I understand that when people apply for the special agent position, they can actually apply. They still have to go through the academy. They still have to go through field offices, but they can express their interest in the HRT at the very moment that they apply for the agent position. Do you know anything about that?
I do know that's an option. What it does is it helps to identify prospects. They're looking for some former military, former law enforcement, SWAT. At the same time, they still want you to be an agent first, which I think is of critical importance. I've always told people who've talked to me about this that you need to want to be an FBI special agent first. So you hire on, you go to the academy, you get your first field office assignment, you go there, and you be a street agent for a few years so that you understand what it means to be an investigator, to be a special agent, because that is of critical importance. There's no guarantee you're going to make it through selection. Trust me, there's guys that have been, with the SEAL teams and other really high-speed units, gone to the HRT selection and not made it. There are no guarantees. And there's a lot of unknowns, injury and issues with your family. You may have a spouse that doesn't want to be left alone 6 months out of the year. Your kids, all of these are things that you have to take into consideration. In retrospect, I would not do anything different. The HRT was an amazing unit to be involved with. Travel the world, and you're gonna do things that very, very few FBI special agents get an opportunity to do. The training, the camaraderie, the history, everything associated with it.
Well, it's definitely an elite group in the FBI.
After the HRT, I went to FBI headquarters, and then from there became the Joint Terrorism Task Supervisor, actually created the JTTF in the New Orleans field office. I was there for about 4 years, then went overseas to Athens, Greece. I was the Olympic coordinator for those Olympic Games. From Athens, I came down to Gulfport, and I spent 2 years here, and I retired.
All right, so we're coming to the end now. Two things I want to ask you. The first one is, what are you doing now? When did you retire, and what are you doing now?
I retired in October 2007. After that, I went immediately to work at the University of Southern Mississippi in a grant-funded initiative specific to sports security, doing research for large sporting events like the Olympics and the Super Bowls, things like that. I had worked several Olympics, in my capacity with the FBI. And then I was also a member of their faculty, teaching those same courses, risk assessment methodologies, things like that. Then I did adjunct work at Tulane, teaching in the Department of Homeland Security Studies. And then I did a lot of work overseas with the Anti-Terrorism Assistance Program through the Department of State in about 30 different countries, since retirement. And then most recently, when that grant ran out at Southern Miss, that job went away. And then I was hired by the William Carey University, which is a private university here in South Mississippi that has a criminal justice department, and I'm a faculty member now, full-time, with William Carey University.
I want to give you an opportunity to wrap up your career and your thoughts about the FBI. What would you like to say?
Well, of course, the FBI has been in the news a lot over the past 6 months, through the whole election cycle and everything. I still talk to, a number of active field agents and others, still associated with the Bureau. It seems like the mission has changed some from investigations more to intelligence gathering, but I think that's a sign of the times. I'm always looking for new, good candidates to join the Bureau. I run across a lot in the classroom. I get a lot of questions. Same thing. I encourage them to explore the Bureau. It's a critical piece to securing our society. I don't think that's going to change any. It's going to continue to have that level of importance, and I'm just glad to be associated with it.
And that's the end of the interview. As always, back at jerrywilliams.com, you'll find photos of Jim McGee. You'll find how to purchase a signed copy of his book. If you enjoyed the interview, I hope you share it with your friends, family, and associates. I make it easy for you. At the bottom of this episode's show notes at jerrywilliams.com, you'll find all of the social media share buttons. Because this is such a long episode, I will save my crime fiction recommendation for next week. But I do want to remind you that the 2017 FBI collectible G-Man calendar is still available for free for you. It features photos of FBI toy guns and games from back in the 1930s and 1940s, the time of the G-Man. My crime novel, Pay to Play, about a female FBI agent investigating corruption in the Philadelphia strip club industry, is available now at Amazon.com. This episode was sponsored by FBIRetired.com, the only online directory made available to the general public featuring retired FBI agents and analysts interested in showcasing their skills to secure business opportunities. I want to thank you for listening, and I hope you come back again for another episode of FBI Retired Case File Review with Jerry Williams. Thank you.